On Saturday, a Travis County jury convicted Austin police officer Christopher Taylor of deadly conduct for the 2019 shooting death of Morris Da Silva in downtown Austin. This is thought to be the first time ever in Travis County that a law enforcement officer has been criminally convicted in an on-duty shooting. We wanted to dive into the conviction and perhaps most importantly, what comes next. Joining me now are Austin attorneys Jorge Vela and Flores. And Jorge, I just want to start by asking you, is this conviction a flash, or does it have lasting ramifications for law enforcement here in Travis County?
I think there's zero question that the significance of this case is going to be felt for some time, not only for the residents of Travis County, but potentially all across the state of Texas, potentially all across the country. This was not a black and white case. This was a case that divided the community. If you have seen the video in this case, it shows Marcus Da Silva with a deadly weapon in his hand. Normally, when people hear that, that signifies a justified shooting if police confront that person. In this case, I think that the lasting impacts are going to be that officers are going to think twice about using deadly force, situations where they don't have seconds to think twice. And whether or not this is going to be a good thing or a bad thing depends on who you are, whether you're a police officer, a member of the community, or an accused that may be subject to this force. That remains to be seen in this case, but zero question that the significance of this verdict is going to have ripple effects for some time, especially in our community.
Rick, you agree?
I do. Like Jorge said, it will have rippling effects, but specifically locally here, I think is where we're going to see it felt most. Over the weekend, we heard Michael Bullock, the Austin Police Association president, say that this was a sad day for Travis County and for law enforcement professionals. And I fear, and I know a lot of people in the community fear, that the city of Austin and Travis County in particular is going to have a tough time recruiting and retaining talent. And it could result in police officers not wanting to serve here locally, knowing that there's the possibility that there's a target on their back now by this district attorney, and that an investigation can be started, you can be indicted, and then like we saw over the weekend, you can be tried and convicted. And I'm afraid that that might drive talent outside of our community.
We watched the previous trial last fall involving Christopher Taylor and the death of Michael Ramos. Of course, that resulted in a deadlock jury, a hung jury, and then a mistrial. As you both were anticipating a verdict or an outcome in this case, Jorge, did you think it was headed toward a not guilty or a deadlock jury, or were you taken by surprise by this guilty verdict?
The guilty verdict was completely unexpected, in my opinion. In this situation, we had an individual who was walking around an apartment complex suffering from some type of mental health issue. Granted, we have services now that can address somebody that's suffering from a mental health crisis, but they still had a deadly weapon in their hand, and law enforcement were called for a reason. I myself saw that video, and it was not so clear-cut as the prosecutors presented it in court. I mean, especially as someone that has a family to go home to, when you're in a situation where there is an individual in front of you with a deadly weapon who you don't know, you only have seconds, if not half seconds, to respond and decide whether or not this merits a deadly force response. I think that any defense attorney or any prosecutor would say that this was an unexpected verdict, especially when we compare it to the Michael Ramos case. In the Michael Ramos case, we ended up finding out that Michael Ramos was not armed with a weapon, with a gun or a knife. And in this case, we had an individual that was in close proximity to the police officers when they fired their weapons, and who had signs that this individual had been aggressive. From what I remember hearing from the presentation of the evidence, there was blood on Mr. Da Silva. I mean, if I'm seeing that individual for the first time and we have somebody that's unstable with a deadly weapon, that immediately would cause concern that he is a danger to himself and a danger to the people around him.
Rick, the jurors have made no public comments about why they chose to convict Christopher Taylor, but going inside the juror's mind, if you can, from a defense perspective or from a prosecutor perspective, what do you think it was? What was it about the evidence or about this case that you believe may have led them to convict?
You know, the jury deliberated for 3.5, almost 4 days, which is a long time. May not seem like a long time, but that is a long time. And I think as it went on and on, the possibility of a hung jury, I think, is what everybody was thinking was going to happen. I myself thought that this was a case that was going to come back with a not guilty verdict. But as it went on from one day to the next, all the way until Saturday, it was shocking to see that they struggled with it for so long. And usually, if it's a clear-cut case, deliberations don't last that long. They come back within a day or two, if even that long. And so it's clear that they struggled with it. I think that that's something that in and of itself is going to be of significance to the community, that these are not easy cases, that there are lots of angles to look at it, and it'll be something that'll be considered by the judge when she decides what the punishment is, that this wasn't a quick verdict.
Which takes us to a very important question, and looking ahead. What do you anticipate, and Rick, I'll start with you. What do you anticipate the judge will do with regard to punishment? Of course, this is a third-degree felony with punishment range of 2 to 10 years, but it's also an offense for which probation is eligible as well. What is a just punishment in this case?
Right, and like you said, Tony, it's a third-degree felony, so it carries with it the possibility of 2 to 10 years in prison, but it's not a guarantee. They did file an application for probation, and so his attorneys will obviously argue for that, and I think that that's an appropriate punishment. Again, because the jury struggled with this, it wasn't a quick verdict. It shows that there was not a clear-cut case here. They'll take into consideration his background, his criminal history, and other things that were not admissible during the trial. Those are some of the things that the judge will take into consideration. Now, one thing to also point out is that he could get probation, but that the judge who's issuing the punishment could also add local county jail time as a condition of probation. And that could be a way that I think that this might go, that he would get some period of years of probation, but then tacked onto that also maybe some time in the local county jail as a condition.
Jorge, can the judge in this case, Dana Blasey, consider the fact that Christopher Taylor also previously stood trial in another case involving a shooting death that involved Michael Ramos, and the fact that jury was deadlocked? Is that something that she can factor into her calculation?
That's a great question, Tony. And the short answer is yes. She can consider any other what we refer to as extraneous conduct. Now, she has to find that there was evidence that he committed that extraneous conduct, and in this case, we're referring to the Michael Ramos shooting. It's going to be a factor in her decision. That's zero question. But I will say, I do not admire the position that Judge Blasey is in. It is a very difficult decision to render a just, quote unquote, a just sentence in this case. I mean, this case is already highly publicized. The sentence can make it spread like wildfire. I mean, if we see a probation verdict from this judge, it could have very angry reactions from the public, including Texas, nationwide, even internationally. We have a police officer that was convicted for shooting a killing in the line of duty. If it's a stiff sentence, the maximum 10 years, which I don't think is going to happen in this case, again, it's going to be a significant verdict that everybody will want to report on. And so I will say to the court, I mean, the world is watching. The world is watching what this judge is going to do in this case. We are talking about a career prosecutor. I will say this. Judge Blasey, we've both been in front of her. She's very fair in my experience so far. But I do think it merits pointing out that she has been a career prosecutor all her life. She's never been a defense attorney. She's been a very fair judge in my experience. But again, this is not an easy case, regardless of what your experience or background is.
Rick, yesterday evening, we reported that Austin's new police chief, Lisa Davis, was meeting with her executive team and looking internally within APD, training policies to prevent this type of situation from happening again. If you are a brand new police chief in this town, what are you doing to look at your training, look at policies, to do just what she said their goal is, and that is to not have something like this happen again?
It's a tough position to be in. We heard during the trial Officer Taylor's attorneys say that he followed local procedures, he followed local standards and training procedures, not only locally, but also national standards. And so, of course, it's good that they're looking at this to prevent things like this from happening. And like Jorge mentioned that there are resources that you can call in, mental health services and such. But this is the type of case that it could happen at any moment. And so to go back and say that Officer Taylor did something wrong or that they need to go back and retool their standards, it's not quite that clear cut. And so it's a very difficult position to be in because it's not like they can completely retool the approach. I think half of the community, for example, would argue that what Officer Taylor did is exactly what he should have done.
I want to ask you, both of you, this. Rick, I'll start with you. Obviously, we anticipate that Officer Taylor will appeal his conviction. What does he have to work with? And it's important to note that grounds for an appeal is not just we think the jury got it wrong. So what evidence, what could he and his defense team bring forward?
For the most part, if there's an appellate issue, it's going to be usually some sort of evidence issue, the admissibility of evidence and whether or not something was let in that shouldn't have been let in or something was kept out. I know that there were also some issues on the tail end during the deliberations. There was some reports that some of the jurors had safety concerns and that some of the jurors were also perhaps on social media or were on the internet, which is prohibited conduct during deliberations. And so there are some appeal issues there, and I have no doubt that Officer Taylor's team is going to appeal this, and that's not even to touch on the possibility of a pardon. We saw Governor Abbott pardon Daniel Perry earlier this year, and even if the appeals get overturned or no matter how this turns out, it'll be interesting to see if this is also a type of case where Governor Abbott is going to consider for pardon.
Jorge, prosecutions of police officers, the results have been wobbly at best here in Travis County. We've seen more than 24 officers indicted. About 7 police officers still face charges here in Travis County for different alleged offenses, different incidents. I want to just ask you, does the conviction of Officer Taylor on this deadly conduct charge embolden the district attorney to go forward with those other cases, or does he calculate those cases kind of independently of this verdict?
I think it's important to remind the public that criminal cases state cases are brought by the local district attorney. And so District Attorney Garza has full discretion as to whether or not to proceed with charges against any individual. I think that this win is going to be an opportunity for Mr. Garza to trumpet what he ran on, his platform, which was bringing accountability to police officers. I think that it does give him more courage to proceed with these cases. I mean, after all, these 12 members were 12 members that were selected from the community. They're supposed to represent a broad cross-sector. We cannot forget that Jose Garza is a politician. He is elected by the Travis County community. And so if a cross sample of 12 members of our community found that this was a constituted deadly conduct, I think it does give Jose Garza some encouragement that he's doing the right thing in his own mind by proceeding with the prosecutions of these police officers. Now, I do think, though, that jury selection matters. I think that in this case, the prosecutors, kudos to them, selected the right jury for this particular case. That's not easy to do when you are prosecuting a police officer in a very liberal county like Travis County. And so that drives, again, what I always say is the most important part of this trial is jury selection. You have a vast pool in Travis County of very educated but very liberal people. The prosecutor did a good job selecting the right jury in this case in order to secure the conviction.
One last question, and I wonder, Rick, your thoughts on this. Importantly, there is still a police officer, Officer Carl Crecia, who was indicted on a murder charge and a deadly conduct charge stemming from also opening fire that day on Maurice Da Silva. Is it possible we will find ourselves that in a case where Officer Crecia could go to trial and be acquitted for essentially the same conduct?
Absolutely. And like Jorge was saying, it's so important about jury selection. And we got 12 jurors in this particular case that struggled with it over the course of 3 or 4 days and finally came to the decision to render a guilty verdict, but you could get a completely different 12 set of jurors, also a cross sample from Travis County. And like you said, Tony, they could find the next officer not guilty. And it could, same thing, go over 3-4 days of deliberations, but you can see how they struggled with it, and it wasn't such a quick verdict. And I can see how another group of 12 people could struggle with it, look at the evidence, and then come back with a not guilty verdict. And so while at the same time it does instill some confidence in District Attorney Garza, I think also he's got to be careful moving forward with this, because this is just one case. And we've seen other mistrials, or we've seen other grand juries not come back with indictments. And so it'll be interesting to see whether he runs full steam ahead with this newfound conviction, or if this is something that still they need to tread lightly moving forward with.
Thank you both so much for your time and for being here. Jorge, Vela, Rick Flores, we appreciate your insights today. Thank you.
Thank you.